Well, hi guys, and if you're tuning in, welcome to the next episode of whatever the crap this is.
Tonight, this week's episode of whatever the crap this is.
Tonight we've got a few topics in mind. We wanted to talk about sort of what we were basing our conversation off of earlier while we were just talking before this video. We're talking about purity culture, specifically within sort of church circles that we grew up in, and specifically
community.
not necessarily constrained to that as well. We think it's a very American sort of way of looking at the world, and sort of the way that relates to real life and actual ability to restrain oneself and choose a good life partner, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So look forward to all of that. Just so you know, we are probably going to delve into some topics that might be uncomfortable for some people and probably inappropriate for some children as well as perhaps the use of some language that you might not approve of. So I appreciate that. Just know that if you hear that stuff and it upsets you, you are not our intended target audience. So
that's like the most concise and clear disclaimer there's ever was, I think.
Well, the way I was thinking about it earlier was because I want to do a whole video on nothing but the issue of the use of language, right? So not necessarily what we consider to be vulgarity, but like the way we talk to people, and also getting into social justice culture and the way that words are interpreted as like how you think they're supposed to mean it as opposed to how they actually mean it. Like, for example, if I say, I don't know, so the R word is a big thing, topic of conversation, especially in my family, like given my little brother's situation. Right?
Oh, yeah.
So we sort of decided early on that we weren't going to be, we didn't have like a meeting about it or anything, but we decided early on that we weren't going to be the type of family to get really upset if anyone used it like that. And the reason was because I think every conversation, every person who's a partaker in a conversation, their job's assigned based on your position in that conversation. For example, if you're the speaker, your job is to communicate in the language that you think will best convey your message to the person you're communicating to, right?
Right.
And if you're the person who's listening, your job is to try to best understand the intent and the actual meaning that is being conveyed by the speaker.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, even in church circles and definitely on college campuses nowadays, it's completely the opposite, right? It doesn't matter what you actually meant. It matters which words you use. It matters the medium of your communication.
Which there isn't necessarily no merit to that. I think when you're speaking, you need to take in people's sensitivities into account and speak accordingly.
Absolutely. Now, would I ever drop the F-bomb in front of my grandmother? Absolutely not.
As well, you shouldn't.
As well, I shouldn't, right? If I'm talking to my friends?
Exactly.
Right.
The intended audience, the intended individual, whatever it is.
Right.
That's it plays.
You go to the Greeks as to the Greeks, you know, like it's that basic principle. But anyway.
We're getting way off topic here.
Way off topic here. So, sort of what drove the conversation earlier is we're both talking about sort of people we knew that grew up and are very sort of, I guess you could call
ourselves included.
Ourselves included in that. Sort of like a repressed culture when it came to all things dating, sexuality, and sort of navigating that. It was sort of the solution to every problem was you just stay out of it. So, for example, pornography is obviously a huge problem in today's culture as far as the addiction that comes with that. And the solution that we were dealt as children, where you just never, ever see anything like that and you're good.
Right.
Right. Like, that's the ultimate solution. You only see your wife's boobies. And unfortunately, that is completely incompatible with actually living in this day and age. As opposed to learning how to deal with something like that, we learn to just completely steer away from it. And unfortunately, our male dispositions are not such that are well inclined to do such.
Oh, absolutely not. Like, I mean, perhaps in one day and age you could have positioned yourself where you never had to deal with anything like that. But the freaking I'm thinking of the Hardee's ads from a couple years ago that were overly sexualized. Like, you cannot escape the sexualization of anything in this day and age. Right. So pretending that you can just put yourself in a place where you can't see that at all is approaching certain levels of impossibility at this point, unless you want to cloister yourself or become a monk or things like that.
Right, and I think that sort of speaks to an overwhelming theme in a lot of cultures that were similar to the ones that we grew up in, and that's a sort of utopian attitude of we can control this and we can keep the world out, and that's how we're going to deal with things, without realizing that is a completely unattainable and decidedly unchristian goal. But the idea that you should be isolationists like the Amish and just completely put up these walls where you never actually encounter temptation.
Right.
And I
mean, you wouldn't be able to go to an art museum if that were the case. Like, I remember being however old, like early high school years, taking field trips to art museum and just being not okay for the rest of the week because I saw some statue or some painting of a girl with her boobs out, or more than that even. Like, you can't avoid it.
Right. Right. And I remember just growing up, especially like, being homeschooled, you don't get out like super often. But even like the things you get in the mail, like it could just be like the Kohl's catalog with the underwear section. Like that's enough to like really bother someone who does not know how to deal with it.
Right.
Right. So, but
I think that's part of what we both advocate, is just bringing ourselves not to a place necessarily where we give into it, but a place where we can deal with it in a adult and mature manner. Like you pointed out earlier, the European countries.
The European, like classical European culture, at least, is definitely more open about this sort of thing. And generally speaking, this is a point I made earlier. I'm not going to actually give you the citation for this research, but you can look it up yourself. Generally, the trend is that the most sexually repressed countries, you think specifically of the Arab nations, where this sort of thing, like any sort of public expression of sexuality, is very frowned upon, have actually the highest consumption rates for pornographic material, as opposed to those cultures that are way more open about it. And I think there's good reason for that. It's because you try to completely avoid the problem, and this is something that C.S. Lewis talked about, sort of the Victorian idea of hushing up this sort of thing, and that's the way we're going to deal with it. We're just going to sweep it all under the rug and pretend it doesn't exist, and we're not going to talk about it because talking about it might, make someone feel a certain way about it, as opposed to actually living in the world and learning how to confront it head on. So it's that same sort of conflict. I think for me, the biggest sort of thing that I realized growing up, and especially now considering dating, I don't want someone who came from that sort of background. Or like, I think sort of, if we were to ask our grandparents to find us like ideal mates, like obviously you're taken. But in my case, it would be someone who's very much like has not a lot of world experience. And I think, and probably has grown up sheltered in a very similar way to the way, I would say me more so than you did. I don't know. It's kind of give and take there.
Shout out to my mom and dad. Thanks for being awesome.
Oh no! I don't want to shove this on my parents. No. It was the culture. It was the culture that we were sort of immersed in.
I would say mine was more self-inflicted than perhaps yours was, but mine was still self-inflicted. Like, I bought into that purity culture hardcore. I bought into you're gonna date only the girl you're gonna marry, and we called it courtship. We kind of talked about that briefly, but
yeah. Let me hand this one to you. Like, what if you had to give a definition for purity culture? What would you give it?
Purity, like the nigh obsession with not being in a relationship with anyone other than your life mate, your spouse. That is how I would define it.
And this is going back to like when we were 13.
Right. Early high school, junior high, early high school.
Right. I remember
first becoming interested in people of the opposite gender.
Right. And sort of the implication was that if you were going to talk to a girl when you were like, in that stage of life, first question that those of us, the authorities in our life at the time would ask us would be like, do you think you could marry this girl? Like, as if that's a relevant question to the situation.
Right.
As opposed to, maybe I just am curious and like to get to know her. That sort of thing.
Right. That's like, there's almost like there is no room for that in purity culture. As the purity culture we're talking about. It's like if you're talking, seriously with any, in our case, talking seriously with any female, or even talking in a friendly capacity with any female, it's assumed that you either are pursuing feelings for them, have feelings for them, or think you could have feelings for them.
Right. So I think we did not go on a lot of dates in high school.
Right.
I mean, my first one was 17.
I was a little older than you, but it was probably self-inflicted and probably not a good thing for my own mental health. But
Right. And I mean, most people would never guess that about me nowadays if they've known me for the past 4 years or so. But no, like the culture was such that you did not even pursue getting to know someone unless you had a direct intention of marrying them.
Right,
which is absurd.
Absurd. I was just gonna say the same thing.
It's absurd.
Like, how can you know whether or not you want to marry someone unless you have spent time with them, gotten to know them, seen if you're compatible.
Right. Well, I think part of it's this sort of theological value that people kind of go back to. And it's kind of funny because even in the circles we grew up in, it wasn't a particularly popular theological value. I think that there are certain theological values that are just so embedded in the culture that it doesn't matter what the preacher thinks.
Mm-hmm.
It's just there. I think it's something that's been there, sort of like as you were talking about earlier. You had this sort of sexual revolution back in the 60s and 70s, and the evangelical, or just in general, the Christian America response to it was purity culture, and you were kind of railing against that earlier.
Well, I think it's done much more harm than it's done good. I mean, it's in the context of our conversation, like it's created people who are much more likely to experiment once they get even the small taste of freedom and go off the rails completely. I mean, I nearly did myself, and I just thank my lucky stars and my Lord that I didn't. But the purity culture creates a bunch of repressed individuals, repressed people that when they see that they don't have to abide by the standards which they've been held to anymore, just absolutely lose their minds. The Christian homeschooler goes to college and loses it.
Crazy.
Right.
Goes crazy. No. That's sort of dead on though, and I think it's fundamentally this issue of. And I was talking last night with some very old, very good friends, and they're now at the point where they're homeschooling their children.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Their children are still, I believe, all under the age of 10. Got a bunch of them, and they asked me flat out, like, what was my experience with homeschooling, because they knew I grew up with it. Did I like it? And what I told them, like, just straight up, was it was great, especially like academically, put me way ahead. I feel,
yeah.
Especially when it came to self-discipline issues like how to manage your own time. By the time I got to college, people are just figuring out how to make their own schedule. I'm like, shoot, I've been doing this for years.
Right.
You know, and that part of it was nice. But as far as the sort of social aspects of it, I said point blank, you have to make sure your goal is to make your children ready for the real world.
Yes, yeah.
And not to try to keep them from doing bad things or keep bad things from them. I said part of socially in general, the thing I struggled with the most when I got into the real world, when I was probably 16 through 18 was probably the roughest time for that, was actually having to deal with learning how to read people and understand what people were, what their intentions were, when I had never done that before. Like a basic version of that is, how can I tell if someone is actually trying to be my friend or if they just want something from me? It took me a long time to figure out how to navigate that one, because I was not used to the social politics that everyone is so ingrained in, and they hate it for good reason.
Oh yeah.
That you experience, to say, if you went to a public high school. And part of that is, in relation to what we were talking about earlier, is you have to understand the good, the bad, and the ugly about the dating world. And you have to understand all of that. It's better you understand that at a young age and get hurt. I think not good in and of itself that you get hurt, but I think it's necessary.
Oh, pain is necessary for growth. If you never experience any pain, you're not going to develop as a person.
Right. So what I'm saying is you have this army of sort of, I would say, like, not specifically just the homeschool crowd, but you've got a sort of army of very conservative parents, and the way they elected to deal with the situation is just to keep their kids completely out of it, so that they have absolutely no life experience with actually dealing with it when they inevitably get into the real world.
Right.
The only way that you can mitigate that is to sort of keep yourself in the bubble the entire time, right? You don't go to secular college, you go to Christian college, you don't go to whatever else. And I don't think that is an adequate way of dealing with the situation, because
eventually you have to leave that bubble.
Right. Or you just rely on the security that the bubble offers so much that you are rendered absolutely useless in the real world. Right. So you didn't go to regular college to get a degree in a skill that would actually pay the bills. Because you were worried that you might, get yourself into a social circle that would cause you to do things that you disagree with. Right. Or that you'd have bad influences, or that you might, God forbid, change your mind about something. So that way you just sort of isolate yourself as much as possible to keep out all of the bad influences, and then you end up becoming sort of an isolationist that has no real efficacy.
Right.
So.
And the goal should be to create people with enough mental acuity to go into those challenging places, regardless of what they are, and deal with the challenge at hand and to embrace it in a sense.
Right.
Whether that be a challenge of the dating scene or of like an intellectual capacity in a class, it doesn't matter. Like, you want to create people who are capable of dealing with the crossroads in their own brain.
Right. Well, more than that, I think there's skills that need to be acquired that go beyond like moral classification. Like, for example, I think it's a good thing as a guy to know how to talk to girls of your own age.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right? Did I know how to do that when I was
you
18?
didn't.
No, granted, a lot of guys don't, but I definitely felt like I was,
I laughed, but I was just as bad.
I was sleeping through the first lap there, and I didn't know what I was doing. Like, frankly, I was always kind of like chock full of cockiness about that sort of thing. I just made myself look like an idiot so many times because I don't know.
It's funny.
I didn't know what I was doing. And I think it's a objectively a good skill to have. I really don't know if there are many bad skills that you could possibly have in general, right? Mm-hmm. Or knowledge that you could possibly
questionable
have.
Ones maybe, but bad, I don't know.
Right. But I think it's definitely there's a lot of efficacy that can be gained through knowing how to do that. And that might be if you actually meet the person that you think you want to spend the rest of your life with, you are not afraid, or you're not warded off by your own insecurities or your own restrictions in speech, and you know how to basically navigate the waters.
Oh,
right? Yeah. And sort of that was actively discouraged. Like, learning how to do that, growing up.
Right, like what we were talking about. Like, if you're talking to a girl, even, it's because you must have these long-term, permanent sort of commitments in mind to begin with. Like, there was just no place for a casual relationship. At least that's how I portrayed it to myself. Like, for me, it was very self-inflicted. Like, I read books and adopted certain mindsets that precluded me from developing, how would you say, not casual, but like lighthearted, friendly relationships with girls. Like, any relationship that I was pursuing with a girl or had with a girl, the potential for a long-term investment was always the first thing in my mind. The last thing in my mind is, like, I was constantly looking for a mate.
Right. And I think in my own case, my own life story, and unfortunately life stories of a lot of people we grew up with, we ended up making this fatal error of, we end up investing in some relationship with some young lady, or it definitely is true from the other angle too, from young ladies getting invested with young men, but because there's this burden of like, you have to make it work, and like basically you shouldn't have been pursuing them unless they were like husband or wife material in the first place. You're just kind of stuck. So I almost made a very bad decision and proposed to a girlfriend that would have been very bad for me. And I know a lot of people who actually did go through with that decision and are sort of playing out the unfortunate consequences of that. And it was because you weren't allowed to question it once it was in motion.
Right.
Essentially, you had to make it work, because otherwise you'd have to admit that you made a horrible mistake.
Oh, yeah.
And that you were a bad person, right? There's a moral sort of weight hanging over your shoulders when you sort of conceptualize the landscape that way.
Like, when it finally does fall through, you're left with the what did I do wrong sort of scenario. Like, my first real relationship, I mean, it ended probably not the worst way it could have ended, but I was torn up for years after the fact. And I mean, since she's moved on, I've moved on, and we're both doing great. And I don't wish her any ill. I wish her all the best. But it still left me wondering, like, what I could have done to make it work. How did I fail? How could anyone love me? Those sorts of things that are just completely self-detrimental and don't do anything or any good for moving forward with your own life. You kind of get stuck in this state of, well, there goes that.
Right. And worse than that, you feel once you've failed that you're not good anymore.
Yeah.
And that drives you even deeper into a hole. In my case, I did a lot of stupid things. Mm-hmm. So I think the better mindset is to do... We've been talking a lot about the negatives about the sort of culture that we've grew up in, but like, what are we actually vying for here? I think we're kind of on one accord in a lot of senses on this. So, I mean, I read a great article years ago. It was talking about the classical American way of dating, and you'd think it meant, the courtship model, right? So, cowboy walks up to cowgirl's door, don't, talks to her parents, I'm here to call upon your daughter, that sort of thing. as if that is the classical mindset. But it's absolutely not. Actually, what we're talking about is not necessarily how our parents dated or how like the cowboy people dated. We're talking about how our grandparents dated. And the way it used to work is in American English, in American parlance, we have this saying called "going steady." It means absolutely nothing nowadays. Why? Because we've got this mindset of either you're dating someone or you're dating no one, right? As opposed to the classical model, which was you went out with Cindy on Sunday, Tammy on Tuesday,
Right.
and you actually were very socially active with a lot of different potential suitors or partners.
Right, and it wasn't like a taboo thing to be dating several different people at once.
Right, and it was you didn't call it dating necessarily, but you were going out with several different people at once, and the
Right.
intention was that you were actually getting to know them, right? So for in our culture, I'm sure everyone that's our age or younger can relate to this. If you were to ask a girl to go with you to a wedding or vice versa, that's a huge amount of pressure.
Huge.
Like it's everyone there is going to ask you if you're dating. Everyone.
And the implication is going to be it's a long-term, deep, impactful thing because, like, you're bringing them to this family function. Like, how
Right.
could you not bring someone you're completely serious about to this
Right.
family function?
Dude, no. And if you watch, even if you just watch old movies, or if you actually talk to your grandparents about the way they sort of came together, the culture was such that it was not a big deal to just have a nice young lady accompany you to a formal function and have it mean absolutely nothing. Right, there was,
The other
there was
one
a
you pointed
very
out was
casual
the prom.
air to it, or like
It was proms.
right. So what did you call it? Prom.
Well, the promposal, that's a real thing.
Promposal.
Like, it should not be that big of a deal, people. It's
Right.
prom. It's a school dance. There's a couple of them every year. Like, your senior one's the big deal, but it's not a big deal because of who you're taking. It's a big deal
Right.
because it's about your senior year. Like, this is a celebration of you guys having gone through the system and come out on the other side. Like, you're graduating. It's your senior prom. It's not about who you're taking. Like, you take someone because... Like,
Right.
I mean, you got to
And
have a dance partner.
Perhaps part of it is a thing that these sort of functions, these formal functions at least, have become far fewer. And
that's true,
that
too.
could partly go into it, but I think a lot of it is this mindset that you're not supposed to invite, someone to prom, even to that level, unless you've got very serious intentions about this young lady. Like,
Right.
let me just say this very, very bluntly: there is nothing wrong with taking a girl or a guy to a dance, at all, right? Unless you've got some ulterior motives, right? There is nothing wrong with just having them accompany you, right? So in our grandparents' day, this would have been a much more common occurrence, right? It's not a big deal for so-and-so to take you to the prom, right? Or to take you to whatever dance it is, right? No one is going to assume that you're dating. No one is going to assume that you're going to get married one day, or that, like, that's what your mutual intentions are. It's just seen as a very casual thing. Like, naturally, you would be accompanied by someone of the opposite sex to do whatever, right? It's a very casual, open thing, right? And in the same way, the classical model of dating was like you went out with several people. It could be like, multiple people a week, but they're all different people. When you're going steady with someone, that means you've committed to go out exclusively with the same person. And there's a lot of wisdom in actually varying it up and not going out with
I
the
didn't
same.
tell you the story that I'm going to tell you now because you said people usually don't do that in these days. My wife and I, we went steady. That's what happened a couple weeks after we were dating.
Really? So you're
We
saying-
used that terminology and we said we were going to go steady.
Wow. That's actually really cool. I had no idea.
And so
So were you seeing other people at the time? Or?
no, we just we went on.
Or is there just like an understanding of like this is the level that the relationship is at, and
Yes,
this is how we're going
yes.
to frame the situation?
Yes.
Either way, that's awesome.
Yeah, no, it was our. I met her. We went on one date, and then it was the second date, and we said we're going to go steady.
Right. That's awesome.
So we said those words in that. We were both actually thinking about this very topic too, about how our grandparents used to.
We're going to start courting. Like that. Just that.
I remember doing
phrase- That phrase makes me nauseous nowadays. Just
Uh,
the mindset that goes behind it, how insane that is. But anyway.
I mean, it's way too much pressure on young people. Like,
Right.
I mean, and we're 25 and 23 respectively.
Right.
Like, we're still young, But imagine putting that type of pressure on
like
teens.
a 16-year-old,
right?
That's why I was
Right.
saddled. That's what both of us were saddled with at 16, right?
16, 17, 18. It's like, here, we are graduating high school, beginning the rest of your life, getting ready to go to college. But also, if you're dating anyone, it better be the person that you're going to marry.
Right. Imagine the amount of pressure that's just saddled upon your shoulders of like, if you're even going to ask someone out to go to see Shrek 2, like, you know, like you've got to make sure that they're the one, or like you've got to have the explicit intention of marrying
another
this
thing
girl,
we can go
or
off
else
on.
it's immoral. Like, that is absolutely absurd.
Right, there's another tangent we can go on.
Shrek 2?
No, not tangent. the concept of the one, the idea that there's this soulmate out there, this one person that you belong with.
The thing is, that's not even like it is a theological like sort of concept, but
It's
it's so popular outside of the theological
It's a theological secular concept. Like it's embedded in both is the problem, and it's completely counter to like just
any rational theology.
Rational theology or rational thought for that matter.
Yeah. So you want to dig into that a little bit?
Okay, well, we both disagree with the concept of the one, your soulmate, so to speak. Or the way I like to put it is the soulmate is something you forge with someone. You are forged. It's an active choice that you make to be someone's soulmate. It's not that you were predestined from the beginning of time to be with this one person, and if you end up with anyone else, you're not going to reach your maximum potential happiness.
In church terms, you've got one. God's got one person they've picked just for you, and it's your job to find/wait for them.
Right. The waiting part, we'll get into that in a minute. But the waiting, you got me hung up on the waiting. I know
waiting is the hardest part.
Well, I just have known people that waiting has hurt them more than anything else.
Absolutely.
It's hamstringed them to the point where they don't know if they're ever going to end up with someone because it's not been the right person.
So my dad actually would agree with this on this topic, right? He has always taught me to sort of rebel against this very popular idea that's in Christian culture, specifically more, I would say, legalistic, but if I'm going to be honest, more Calvinist theologies, more deterministic theologies, right? And it's the idea of the dot. And this is where John MacArthur and I agree, because I heard a great sermon by him about this less than 2 weeks ago. So John MacArthur rails against the dot theology. The idea is that you've always got to be on the dot. Like, there's all this space, but God wants you here. And if you're not here, then you're doing something wrong, all right? So, like, you've got all of the fish in the sea. God's got only one for you, right? So imagine if we took this sort of popular idea that people get from dating and we applied it to, say, finding a job, right? God's got one job for you, Michael.
Well, see, that's the thing. You kind of hear that a little bit too, but we can go into that later.
I mean, it's equally absurd, but it's just a little bit more obvious that it's absurd.
Right.
Right, because anyone who actually goes out into the job market and tries to get a job knows that there's not just one job, right?
Yes.
Or, like, imagine the amount of pressure that anybody who believes that going into a job market or the dating world has on their shoulders.
Oh, yeah.
You've got one thing that's right for you to do, and your job is to find it. Otherwise, you're doing something wrong. Yeah. Right. As opposed to, like, you've got Nancy and Sally and Tammy, and they're all great gals, and you got to decide which one of them you actually like the most.
Yeah, how did we put it earlier? It's like a what's it, a Venn diagram, the one that intersects?
Yeah, like the two circles that intersect.
Yeah, it's a Venn diagram of like ways in which you are compatible, ways that you can help each other excel, and then you pointed out the status question, which is an important question, which people don't like to talk about, but it is one.
It's absolutely so. The idea of leagues. So, like, you probably know what the other two things he was talking about are. So let me explain like the concept of what I'm talking about. So,
and just disclaimer, I agree with him slightly on this, but not necessarily completely.
So, sexual market value is sort of, if you could put it, it's sort of a relative value you have in the dating world. Like, just like with anything else, like you're a company selling a product, or you're a business owner who's looking to have customers in any way like that. Just, you are essentially, as a single individual, a product that someone has to want to buy, right? You have to be so physically attractive and so wealthy or so intelligent or X, Y, and Z, right?
It can be a bit more abstract than that too. It can be future potential as well.
Your trajectory, right? Like, are you on the path to be doing great things? Like, these are all things people factor into it. And guys and girls tend to factor different sort of things into account when it comes to this. Guys obviously tend to focus more on the physical aspects as opposed to
Not all guys and not all girls fit into this category.
Not blanket
There's
statements.
out-
I'm talking overall trends here, right? So overall trends, whether they be cultural or biological, that's just sort of the lay of the land. So when we're talking about dating, my contention is that leagues are, I mean, we think of them as leagues. Like we say, oh, she's a 10 or oh, he's an 8, whatever. But they're kind of a real concept in the sense that that's the sort of value that we assign to someone's sexual market value, right? How desirable are they as a potential mate, right? And we're not even talking about specifically in casual terms. We're talking about like how desirable is this person as a wife or as a husband, right? And unfortunately, if there's a great mismatch in those sort of categories, I don't see that as being a positive thing for a relationship. Let's say you're in the classic cheesy 80s movie and you're the nerd kid who somehow manages to steal the captain of the football team's girlfriend because he's just a jerk, you know. I can't see that relationship working out well. And the reason is because Stacy, the captain of the or whatever, she could be the cheer captain, whatever. She is going to have 10 suitors to every one that you have knocking on her doors, or in today's terms, or you're like flooding in her DMs every day, and that's going to be a constant strain in the relationship. Not because you have an inherent distrust in the relationship, but because basically anytime you get into an argument, the other person has a good reason to weigh their options to see like, well, Steve, who's the personal trainer on Tinder or whatever, or not on Tinder, but on Instagram, he would never talk to me like this, you know?
I see. This is where I disagree with you because, like, you talked about it, the market value, the sexual market value, or the relationship market value concept. Yep. You see it in much more
economic terms,
economic currency terms, however you want to put it. I don't necessarily see it in that.
No, I don't want to say that these are hard and fast rules. I want to say these are general trends.
I think they are trends so long as individuals submit themselves to those trends. I think that people can absolutely come past those things and realize that as mismatched as a relationship might seem on paper, that doesn't matter when the two individuals can coincide and collaborate and conjoin, however you want to say it, in a way that is complementary to one another. I think that if you forsake the relationship capita, so to speak, that you can more easily move past those things which would seem to hang up a relationship.
I think I can resolve this sort of dispute that you and I have. All right. So I think what I'm arguing for is not that it dooms a relationship, but that it puts a significant strain on a relationship. Why? Because it's an external strain, right? I don't think it's something that is inflicted internally. I don't think it's Susie or...
But see, I see it only as a strain so long as you submit yourself to it being a strain.
Right. So I'm saying it's a strain, and I think what you're arguing is that it doesn't matter if it's good enough, you can overcome the strain, and I agree with you. But I still think it's a strain. I don't think every relationship of that manner is going to be like off balance and there's going to be constant conflict. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying absolutely with certain people they can overcome that strain.
Okay, let's take this classic.
What I'm saying is as a trend overall, if you knew that you had 10 options that were in the moment more appealing to you than your current significant other, that is going to be a strain for you personally, especially if there is any existing conflict in any way between you and your current significant other. I'm saying that is going to inevitably, not because of the relationship itself, but because of human nature, things that we can't unfortunately transcend, that is going to be...
Oh, you're going to open a whole other worm can of disagreement. But let me say my bit. Okay, let me paint you an example.
First, my coconut is empty.
Cowboy Cognac. It's
not a sponsor, but you could be. Not a sponsor. You could be.
Not a sponsor. Okay, let me paint a picture, give you an example. Let's say we got Dylan. Dylan's a pretty darn good looking guy. 7.5, 8 in some.
Dylan's hot.
Dylan's hot. All right. And he's with Becca. Becca is a 7. She or 6.5, 7. She's not quite as hot as Dylan, but she's still good looking. She makes twice as much as Dylan. Dylan's working part-time as a personal trainer. She is the darling sales rep at a large corporate in the city. She's making more than twice his income. Dylan knows he could be with anybody else. He could be with some 9s or 10s if he wanted to be. He's got the bod. He's got the potential. He's moving up in life. But Dylan has decided that he doesn't want to bother with any of the traditional things that play into a relationship. Dylan wants to look at Becca, realize the potential, if you will, for their level of harmony, and deal with any sort of upstarts and problems that they might have.
Right. So I think your connection.
So he doesn't even consider when the DMs slide in and everything, because he's got a large social media presence. He's a personal trainer. He's communicating with these people all the time. He's pushing his gym,
right?
And he's getting messages all the time from cute girls, fit girls, that he doesn't pay any mind to because he's moved beyond that. He doesn't even think about it anymore.
Right, and I'm not saying, like, once again, so perhaps I should have phrased that differently as far as transcending those things go. I think part of what it means to be a good man is to know what positions to put yourself in and what that are more vulnerable than others, right? So I think as a guy...
All right, well, flip it around then. Have Becca be the personal trainer. And Dylan's making all the money, but she could be with any guy that she wanted.
Oh, I would say, right, but I would also say
But she's also not worried about it. She's not worried about it. She's not worried about any fights that they might have because she's committed to making it work regardless.
Right. I'm saying that it can transcend that. I'm still saying that's not necessarily, especially in the first situation, that's not an ideal position for a relationship. Like, for example, I think that a person who of very high intelligence and a person of very low intelligence can make a relationship work, right? If they have that same modicum of commitment and a mutual understanding of what the relationship is and should be, right?
I think you have to define what you mean by intelligence first off, but for the sake of the argument,
on the IQ scale, like I'm talking about literal cognitive ability, right? So we've got a person who, I'm not talking about how well read you are. Let's put it that way. I'm talking about, can we have conversations that are on the same level, right? Can we understand each other and communicate well, right?
So well, can we, or are you too high-minded to even have a conversation where we can have mutual conversation? Are you too high-minded so that we can even have a conversation?
But I'm saying it's more than just having a conversation. It's also being a check to someone else. Like, for example, I think a very valuable thing in a relationship is having someone who can check you when you're wrong. And if someone
absolutely,
has
that's a
no
valuable thing,
right? No,
that doesn't necessarily make or break a relationship.
Right. But let me just ask you this, just sort of get to the root of it. Do you think it's preferable that two people of comparable intelligence get together, or that two people of very varying intelligence, like you got the PhD and the person who's the high school dropout, getting together?
Well, I mean, you can't just define intelligence on that, because some of the smartest people I know are high school dropouts.
Okay. Let's go with the little. That's why I started with IQ as a more literal measure, like your cognitive ability, how quick you are, right? How not necessarily
IQ does not wisdom make, though.
Wisdom and IQ are completely different things.
Right.
We're arguing specifically
That's because someone
IQ.
who's completely intelligent and completely competent in any sort of academic situation can be totally upended by someone of a completely lower IQ that just has an ounce of wisdom more than them.
Okay, well, IQ is not intelligence. Well, sorry, IQ is not academic.
IQ is cognitive ability.
Right, that's not academic.
Not necessarily.
Right. So some of this, I will agree with you. Some of the smart people I know never went to college.
Right.
Right. And honestly, if I was a little bit smarter, I probably wouldn't have either. But
oh man,
I don't want to split hairs about that specific issue. What I'm saying is, on that, let's say
the disagreement here is that you think that they are things which are part and parcel of a dating scene that always play a factor, regardless of whether you want to acknowledge them or not. Right. My position is that they don't have to.
If you've got a position where one person has a lot of external influence, like you've got external influences that are really going to be a hindrance to the relationship. Like, for example, someone who comes from a great family that's loving and supportive, and you've got someone who comes from a terrible family that is not loving and supportive, right? I think that is more strain on the relationship than if they are equally matched.
I disagree completely. I disagree completely because the person that came from the terrible family could realize the blessing that they've received in basically gaining a new family.
But you're thinking,
because if the person that had the great family has such a great family, that family is going to now accept that significant other as one of their own.
But you're arguing in idealistic terms here.
Yes, I am, and I always.
What I'm saying is, so for example, I do not think that the best way to quell drinking is to just stop drinking and keep hanging out at a bar.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. What I'm saying is there are some situations in which
don't confuse idealism with absolutism.
Right. Well, maybe I should have used that term instead. I think you're being a little bit absolutist.
I would disagree.
All right. Talk about that later. What I'm saying is, I think to be a good man or good woman, there are certain situations that even though you know the right thing to do, of which you are absolutely capable, right, you should avoid making it harder on yourself than need be. So, for example,
I will acquiesce the pragmatic point of view to you on this.
That is entirely...
what you're advocating is much more functional than what I'm advocating. Yes.
I'm saying, let's say you have two persons that you're potentially going to start pursuing a marriage with. Right?
Yes.
You've got one of them where that strain exists, right? One of them that's equally matched in, say, IQ to you, or physical attractiveness, or whatever merits you want to put, sexual market value. And you've got another that is very mismatched with you. Which one do you choose?
Right.
And everything else is equal. Like you get along just as well, and you have great like you love their families just as much, and you think that, you still think the world of them, and either way you would just make it work. Which one do you choose? I would argue that you go with the lower temptation choice, 100%.
And see, I don't know if I would entirely agree with that, but I will give you your piece of advice that when you're on the dating scene like that and such, that you look for the lower strain options. Not that you necessarily need to go with that. Not that it couldn't be a completely fulfilling relationship if you had the strain, but that looking for the low strain generally yields more positive results. I will give you that.
Can I illustrate this with some personal experience? I've always had an issue with... So for myself, what I want is someone who is able to put me in my place and check me. Me and my old roommate used to joke about this all the time. We want a girl with a little fight in her. Like, that's just the way it is. I don't want someone who does not know how to stand up to me and all of the things I like to do and understand what I like to do, and as well as like being able to combat me
different than what
on
you're
that level,
about.
Right?
That's
someone who's a life aid in that sense to sort of check my worst inclinations, because they have a level of competence that is around the same level as mine.
But that's different than what you're talking about.
I think part of that is the same thing as what I was talking about. Like, for example, I don't want to go back into that again. No, you know what? I will. So let's say you've got the 10 and the 2 that somehow are dating because it's an 80s movie and that just happens miraculously. And the 10 and the 2 can't check each other in a lot of ways, because what sexual market value, by the way, means way more than just physical attractiveness.
Oh yeah, no, I know that.
All right, but because their actual efficacy in the world, their competence to actually make things happen in the real world is limited depending on that sort of value, right? So basically, they're mismatched in power, as it were. It's not merely who can get the most.
I think we hit
Tinder
on the core
matches.
of it then.
Right. It's not really
it's a power
who can get the most Tinder matches. It's do they have comparable sway over each other's life in a good way, right? Do they have basically...
I think this is the heart of why we disagree then, because to me power is a social structure and convention which is to be excelled past. To me, power is something you submit yourself to. Once you stop submitting yourself to it, it doesn't play any sort of role in anything you do.
True. But let's say that, we've got two people who are happily married or whatever, and then one of them gets a huge pay raise, right? Like one of them's making
great.
Double.
I have a sugar mama now.
Right. But then that other person introduces a strain to the relationship as such where the other person can lay claim to more aspects of the other person's life because the mutual
Only if that other
the
person
mutual
wants to make
contribution-
claims like that on such
But
things that the other person is now being
you can
claims to.
never assume the ideal situation. We're talking about
Yeah, I
dealing
think
with
you
other
can
people.
though.
You can with regards to yourself and the sort of things that you subject yourself to. If you find yourself in a relationship or in a situation
I think
where
once you
feel like it's unequally matched, there are always right and wrong ways to deal with it. That's not what I'm arguing. I'm not arguing that you can't do the right thing once you're in that situation. What I'm saying is you are putting yourself in a situation where the other person could choose to do something which you find immoral, over which you've got no power. And it's preferable. Let's say, let's like go back dive down into sexual market value. A lot of that is, frankly, people who have had a lot of past sexual interaction are not as sexually valuable, generally speaking, as people who have had very little, right? Just because people find it gross, right? It's something that's kind of internal, biological, and moral in a lot of ways, right? So you've got a person who is, let's say, ex-male stripper, right? And you've got him paired with Judy the church girl, who has never done anything like that in her life. That is going to put a burden upon her that could actually very much limit her, and likewise for him, because they're just not matched in that particular category, right? I'm saying it's a matter of, I think all of it comes down to a matter of pragmatic efficacy in the real world.
And I don't necessarily agree with that. I agree with the pragmatic sense of it, and I agree that it is useful to keep in mind if you find yourself on the dating scene or when you are participating in the dating scene. But when you actually create the relationship like that, your own individual self with another individual person, the pragmatic goes out the window.
Okay. So can we find common ground on at least the issue that you should date someone who's able to check you?
I would agree with that, but I would disagree with the fact that you think that's part of the sexual market value. I think that's a trait that you desire in a mate. That's different.
A matter of personal taste rather than a matter of objective obligation.
Yes.
I think it's a matter of objective obligation.
Okay, well, I don't necessarily think if someone who is PhD, doctorate level intelligence, and wise to boot with that can absolutely welcome someone who's not that into their life and not find it a burden, then they'll be just fine. But you want that in a mate. That's different. The personal taste side of it is going to be a completely individual thing to every single person who's in the dating world. I think finding compatible things between personal tastes is very important, but I don't find that to be a pragmatic sort of thing that you can like condense down into a little nugget of however you're trying to put it, sexual market value.
Let's talk about the other things then, because I don't think we're gonna come to.
No, I don't think we are, but I think it's important to note because you want someone who's like that for you, just like I kind of wanted someone like that for me. And other people have different things that they want in a mate, and that's important to know about yourself.
I feel like maybe this is a new can of worms, but let me like rephrase and sort of reframe the conversation like this. I think a lot of the reason it is good to find someone is because not only like it will give you like stability and pleasure and all of those things. I think a huge part of it is it will give you more efficacy in the world. It will make you a better person.
But they don't need to be intellectually challenging to do that.
Right, I'm saying they have to make up for it in some other way. They have to be
on
the same level.
When you're jointly responsible for each other, you're going to have to create more efficacy for yourself, regardless of the minutia of that.
All right, this is when I will yield this point to you because I am an unmarried man.
It's not because I'm married. I had this idea before I was even engaged.
Well, I guess we'll just leave it at that. So let's talk about real quickly. I know we've been going for 48 minutes so far.
Holy shit!
I know. Let's go into the other aspects of what we're talking about.
Purity culture and the
purity culture. No, you named two other things that you thought were important as far as dating goes.
Compatibility.
Compatibility. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, no, that's a very important thing. Like, you have to be, like, we were discussing the soulmate idea, the idea of the one, and how we both think it's a bit ludicrous. And the idea is to find someone who you are compatible with, not someone who is your soulmate.
With whom you are compatible.
Thank you. There we go. That's what I was trying to get to. But someone you are compatible with intellectually, someone you are compatible with physically, someone you are compatible with in an economic sense even. That's what you're trying to find when you're looking for someone.
And how is that different than what I was just saying?
Because you're trying to paint in broad strokes. I'm trying to paint on an individual level. When you're looking at compatibility, you're creating a like a top 10 list of things that you're looking for in a mate on an individual level. The things that you are looking for in a mate, the things that Joe Schmo is looking for in a mate, the things that
more the subjective
Becky whoever is looking,
as opposed to the objective.
Because when you're talking about dating, you're talking about individuals, you're talking about subjective values to begin with. You got to find people whose compatibility meshes. The things that they're looking for are fulfilled in the person that they find. The best way for both of those people.
And that's why we can agree.
Right, that's why I agree with your pragmatic thing, because when you're looking for people with a similar sexual market value, as you put it, you're going to find more compatible things like that from the get-go. That's why I can agree with your pragmatic side of it, even if I disagree with the principle of it.
Okay. So even if you're...
Which we found a way to agree, actually.
Right. I think this is the way I can sum it up. If his rule is absolutely true, then mine is a natural byproduct. And if my rule is absolutely true, his rule is a natural byproduct. So
there we go. So we're both wrong. Yeah.
We're both right and wrong. And that's a great way to wrap this up.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.